Okay, BookTube, here's another video. This video will be a general discussion about what I've been reading since I've made my last video. Won't be comprehensive, uh, but I'll just mention some things that I've been reading and how things are in my reading life so far. Um, but before I get into that, I do want to address something right away. I know I've been tagged quite a few times in a couple of booktube tags, and I haven't done any of them, and there's a few reasons for that. One of them is, I did try making a tag video at one point. I think it was the War and Peace tag by Grix, um, and it ended up being 50 minutes of me rambling on about things, and who wants to watch that? If I'm going to make a 50-minute video, it better be worth it. Or be worth viewing, and I wouldn't want to watch 50-minute tag videos. Like tag videos should be 20 minutes max. And the other ones I have not watched, uh, partly because, or I have not participated in, partly because it's been difficult making videos lately. One because um, I don't I've been using my free time to do my reading, and making videos cuts into reading time. And two, um, I don't live by myself, so then I have other people around, and I don't have much time when it's just me in the house, and making a video during those times is not usually appropriate. Uh, and so I find it better to make videos when it's just me around, when I'm just yapping away to my phone. And right now is one of those times, but they're very few and far between lately, so I have not bothered to make videos. But then when those times do come up, I'll usually just find myself grabbing a book instead. But there's another thing too, and that is I've been trying to get back into the habit of writing quite regularly. Um, and even though I fail at it, I do spend enough of my free time writing that it pushes out even more uh, other times that I would have to make videos. Um, which I consider a fair trade-off, because I do very much enjoy the process of writing, even though it's difficult and I procrastinate. Um, so yeah, that's way the laydown of that. I do have a list of the tags that I've been tagged in, and I would like to get to them at some point. I feel like the shoe is on the other foot right now, because I remember watching, when I was just a viewer of BookTube, where I would watch tags that were made months later from when they were tagged, and I would wonder why it would take so long. Like if I were tagged in a tag, I would probably film that tag the next day and just post it. Um, but I haven't done that, and it's not because I haven't enjoyed the videos or enjoyed the content or enjoyed even the questions, but uh, it's just that I have other. Uh, I just haven't been making videos in general, and um, tag videos are just. There's something about making tag videos. Not that I object to them, because I find them quite interesting. Um, but it's. It just feels like it would take. I don't know if I'm good enough at controlling my thoughts to make them worth viewing. So, I don't know if that's a legitimate way to put it, but that's how I'm going to put it for now. Anyways, 5 minutes in, and I haven't talked about anything that I've been reading. So I'm going to start off with The Fairy Queen. I've been reading The Fairy Queen by Edmund Spenser, which is a big fat narrative, chivalric, romantic poem from the 1590s. And he's basically virtually unknown now. Everyone knows Milton, or at least has heard of Milton in Paradise Lost, but no one knows or reads Spenser these days, it seems. But I absolutely love this. I finished this just about a week or so ago. I won't say a whole lot about it now because I just finished making a video recording my thoughts, my rambling thoughts. It wasn't very organized, but it's my thoughts nonetheless. And so yeah, this is what I've been reading. This was so very enjoyable to read. I don't know why, but when I first heard of this poem, it was through Steve Donahue's Daily Penguin video, and he did one on Edmund Spenser, just in general. And he talked about the Fairy Queen, and he says that it's very off-putting, and he thinks it's quite a difficult poem for people nowadays to read. And I must say that just set a bug in my mind where I thought this would be super difficult and it would be like this great challenge to read. And I don't think it was. I think actually this was an easier experience to read than Milton's Paradise Lost. Uh, and it was more enjoyable to read than Paradise Lost, I think. Because this is a lot of fun, it's got a lot of humor, but it's also quite moral in its outlook, and I actually enjoyed that. I enjoy the even though it is didactic in its purpose and what its goal is. There's still a lot to enjoy here. So that's The Fairy Queen. I'm gonna go with another book that I've been reading for quite some time. It's been very slow reading, but I'm still reading it nonetheless, and it's this book. It's Greece and the Hellenistic World, or the Oxford History of Greece and the Hellenistic World, which is basically a collection of scholarly essays or just about general topics in Greece and the Hellenistic world, so ancient Greece. So then you have, if you look at the table of contents, you have like a chapter on the history of the Archaic period. You got a chapter on Homer, a chapter on Greek myth, a chapter on lyric and elegiac poetry, a chapter on early Greek philosophy, and it just goes on to drama, historians, life and society, classical Greek philosophy, Greek religion and art and architecture, Hellenistic history, Hellenistic culture and literature, Hellenistic philosophy and Greco-Roman art. So it's basically an introduction volume written by scholars on this subject, and I found this used, which was very exciting because I had found the Roman volume of this also used, and so now I have these two as a pair. The reason why it's been slow going is, for one, that first chapter, the history of the Archaic period, was written by a scholar who was a pretty bad writer. He's very academic with his prose and very much in the weeds. But also, when I read up to the lyric and elegiac poetry section, I found that completely uninteresting. Mostly because Greek poetry, other than, say, the major names like Homer and Hesiod, they don't interest me that much because lyrical poetry, I find, I have to read it in translation because I don't know Greek, and reading that kind of stuff in translation just means you're losing the entire point of it in the first place because it's poetry, and poetry is very much predicated on the language that the poet writes in. So, reading it in translation, I'm just getting a summary of the contents of what their meaning is, but I'm not actually getting the poetry or the skillfulness and playfulness or lack of that the poet has. And so I just found that chapter completely uninteresting. I read about half of it and then stopped, just had my bookmark in there, and it fell to the very bottom of the pile of the books I have collected on my shelf here, on my nightstand. But recently, I finally picked it up and I read through that chapter, and then I started the next chapter, which is a lot more interesting. It's about early Greek philosophy, so that's where I am right now. And early Greek philosophy is interesting to me because I have read a lot of the, or at least, yeah, I've read a lot of the pre-Socratics and the sophists, um, their actual fragments that they left behind that still survive today. I read most of the Oxford edition and then some of the Penguin edition of the Sophists. Uh, so then I'm going over a lot more familiar territory there, and so I'm looking forward to reading more of this further instead of neglecting it. And speaking of Greece, I also been reading Plato. So I've read a lot of Plato lately. I've read that Penguin volume of The Last Days of Socrates. Then I read Gorgias, which I talked about in another video, I believe. Then I've read then I read Symposium, and I think I want to reread Symposium because I don't having read Symposium and then thinking it over, or at least and then coming back and then reading this volume, I think there's a lot I missed in Symposium that I think is important to get, but I don't know. We'll see. And then I've read The Republic, which is the most famous uh, work by Plato, and I wanted to do a video on this book, but I don't know if I will, because it's been quite a while since I read this. I think it's about 3 weeks or so since I finished reading this, and it's it's a classic. It's a work, a very influential work, but I'm always surprised by just how, I don't know, confident Socrates is in his conclusions, and yet he uh, prides himself in saying that he is wise because he does not know, or he knows that he does not know, and yet he seems to have a lot of very strong opinions which he think are clearly obvious and quite logical, but yet in modern sensibilities are quite absurd and don't actually make sense in the way that Socrates likes to think they do. So a lot of the philosophy in here I found rather uninteresting, um, and I didn't really, well, I want to say I didn't enjoy it, but that's not totally true because Plato writes his philosophy in dialogues, and I guess I found that somewhat interesting instead of just a dry academic think piece, which I am told is what Aristotle is like, but I have not read Aristotle, so I wouldn't know. And so I'm trying to enjoy the dialogue format as it stands, uh, even though it can, some of the criticism that Socrates gets in the volume Gorgias is very apt, I think, where Socrates gets a lot of yes men. Like, of course, Socrates, that's the logical conclusion. But it's not. And it would just take another couple minutes of thought to know that that's not just the obvious conclusion. Anyways, and I'm not trying to say I'm smarter than Plato because I'm not. Because a lot of this was beyond my mind. Like, Plato does talk about mathematical stuff in here, and he talks about um, some very high concepts of philosophy which I did not grasp, um, despite this volume's best attempt to actually help you through it. Which I gotta say, I gotta give praise to this volume. This volume is translated by Desmond Lee with an introduction by Melissa Lane. So that introduction was very good. I read that introduction first, which very much helped me to situate me in the whole concept of this book, or uh, like what's the general overview and what's Plato, how has Plato been received and whatnot. But Desmond Lee, and this volume I believe is from first made in the 50s. Desmond Lee does something which is very helpful for the beginner. He starts off lots of sections, as you see here, with these italicized notes, where he's basically, for each part, he summarizes what's going to be said, and then he gives a title, and then goes on to the next section. So then here, well, then we have this section, and he's got a little commentary. So there's commentary all throughout. There's a lot of notes. I didn't really use the notes a whole lot because I didn't really need them until I actually really did need them. Because he talks a lot about like certain Greek words that he had trouble translating and that he maybe gives an alternative, but that I didn't find interesting. I just wanted to know what was on the page and come to grips with that. But yeah, it was interesting. Like, this is a very complimentary volume because I would find that if I didn't have those little italicized notes from the translator and that this wasn't organized in the way it was, I think I would be quite lost because the conversation really does go every single different way, every single different direction. They start a conversation, they go through a digression, and then they come back to it. It's somewhere else, and that can get quite confusing at times, and it's hard to keep track, especially since this book is quite long for Plato's works. So I found that was quite helpful. So I do recommend this edition if you are reading Plato for the first time. Though next time I read Plato or the Republic, I do think it would be interesting to read it just as it is, without all those divisions and all those editorial notes, like summarizing this is what's already been discussed, this is where the conversation will go. So getting rid of all that and just reading it as a book would be an interesting experience. But as a way to begin, I think this was the way to go. So I am reading another book by Plato. I'm reading in here, in my e-reader. I started Laws, which is a much more obscure book by Plato, but is another political work of his, and one of the rare books where Socrates is not the actual main character or not at all appears in the book. But I'm only about like 15 pages into that because after reading this, I was rather done with reading Plato for a bit. So I read the introduction to that Laws edition that I have on my e-reader, which I don't have the cover on here. And I'm not really gonna come back to it for a while, I don't think. I'll probably continue it next month. We got around a week left of June. So I'm gonna read something else for the next week, and I don't think I'm gonna pursue much of Plato for a little bit. And especially since the Laws is actually his longest work. It's quite long, and I did not realize that. But I do want to read Plato and I do want to read Laws, though I'm still contemplating if I'm going to read the entire book of Laws because um, I don't know how influential it was compared to some of his other books that I could be reading that I still have to wait on. Like, I want to read Timaeus and Critias, and I also want to read, was it Phaedrus? Phaedrus? The one where they have the discussion of love. So those are the rest of Plato that I do want to read going forward. And then maybe I think what I told myself is I'm going to read about 100 pages of Laws, because there's 500 pages of that book. And I don't know if I need to read all 500 pages. If I read in 100 pages and give it a fair shot, that might be enough, but we'll see. But yeah, after I read The Fairy Queen and finished Plato, I moved on to something lighter because I really wanted something light and I wanted something like a novel. Because even though I do like reading nonfiction and poetry, novels are my preferred format, and and, and they're what I've been reading and what I got into reading when I was a kid. So novels always have like a special pull and tug at my heart when it comes to my reading time. And so I chose a lighthearted children's classic, The Secret Garden by Frances Hodgson Burnett. This was published in I think 1910 or 1911, and it came out with illustrations. And what's annoying about this edition is that it doesn't have any of them at all in this edition. This edition is Wordsworth classics. No illustrations except for that front, where this is one of the original illustrations, this cover image. And it's about a bratty girl who is orphanized, or her who's becomes an orphan. Her parents were quite wealthy, but she becomes an orphan and moves in with her uncle. And her uncle is a very melancholy, sad figure uh, who likes to be alone by himself a lot, and who lives in a massive old mansion and doesn't really live in it much. He's usually traveling abroad because he doesn't want to be at home, and when he is at home, he's isolated to a few rooms. So then she's basically put in charge of the servants, and she just has to uh, fend for herself uh, when she's used to being pampered by her parents. Um, so then it's about her coming to uh, explore the place, and she finds the garden, and they have a massive outside land, and part of the land includes a number of walled off gardens, including one that is off limits, because her uncle had married to a woman who was universally loved, and she had a garden, her own personal garden, that she took care with him, with her husband. And when she died a number of years back, he shut off that garden and never went into it again, and left it be. And she is very curious about that garden that she learns about, and ends up finding a way in, and wants to take care of it for herself, and because she has nothing to do. And that's what she does, and she ends up making friends along the way. Dickon, which is a boy who comes from a very different background than she does. He comes from a very large family, and a large and poor family, uh, with the parents that don't pamper them, that are very much present in his life. And she also comes across a cousin who lives at the same place, who's actually the son of the uncle. Um, and he's a very bratty kid as well, but bratty in a different way, and a very sickly child. And he ends up wanting to learn about the garden as well. And this garden and basically the natural world bring them together, and it affects a lot of positivity into their life. And I thought it was quite refreshing, even though there's a lot of talk about magic here, and but I don't think the discussion of magic here is magic in the sense of supernatural. I think it's very much we don't understand the natural world, so we call it magic. Um, uh, and and once you see it that way, I found um, it made a lot of sense, and I thought it was quite charming. So it's a shorter book. It's around 300 or so pages. I flew through it. For me, flying through a book is like reading it within 3 days. So that's what I did with this, and it was very good. It was just what I needed. I didn't want a book that challenged or was very difficult to read. I wanted something that was a lot more lighthearted, or at least a lot more accessible, I guess. And I'm also moving on to The Illustrated Man. by Ray Bradbury. So what I have not actually talked about on this channel is that Ray Bradbury is basically my favorite author, and I've read a ton of his short stories, including this volume, and his Fahrenheit 451 is one of my favorite novels, or favorite books in general of all time. And I think it was the Bookish Drummer who announced that he's going to be doing a Ray Bradbury book club. So each month he chose a Ray Bradbury book that he wants to read, and then people can join him. And he has a discussion on his Discord, which I signed up for so that I could join in discussing this book. And it's been quite a while since I've actually read these stories, even though I've read a number of them more than once. So, and I think it's been quite refreshing to just go through this story by story, because when I first read this, I was just picking at it. I didn't actually read through it as like a full book. I would I'd probably I think I read it in high school for the first time, and so I would read a story here and there, and that's about it. Well, with this, I'm reading a couple of stories each day, and reflecting on how I used to see them, or at least what my impression of them was, versus how I look at them now that I've reread it. And so that's what I've been reading. I have not finished this. I'm over halfway through. I hope to I should finish this within the next few days, because it's not. I mean, the font is quite large, and his stories are very easy and quick to read. Um, and maybe I'll make a video of that once I've finished it. But I don't know if I'll need to make a video of this. There's not a whole lot more I could say about it. But yeah, that's what I've been reading. And if you have any comments about these books or any questions, feel free to write them down below. And I have taken 27 minutes to make this video, which is not ideal, but it's the way it is. And yeah, just tell me what you've been reading, and how your reading is shaping up this year. So yeah, we'll see you next time.